Hey guys, tonight we're talking about America's favourite way to feel nothing. A pill that fixed anxiety the same way duct tape fixes a leaking pipe. Your doctor prescribes it. Your aunt swears by it. And a whole generation of rappers loved it so much they tattooed it on their faces, right before it started showing up in their autopsies. Turns out the distance between medicine cabinet and morgue is shorter than the prescription suggests. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1981, a pharmaceutical company in Kalamazoo, Michigan, decided that America's problem wasn't capitalism, inequality, or the slow spiritual death of late-stage modernity. America's problem was that people were too nervous. If only there was a pill. There's always a pill. The company was Upjohn, a name that sounds like something you'd call an optimistic elevator. The pill was alprazolam. But nobody calls it that. Everyone calls it Xanax because alprazolam sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, and Xanax sounds like something a rapper would get tattooed on his forehead, which incidentally several did. The chemist behind it was a man named Jackson Hester Jr., who had been tinkering with benzodiazepine molecules since the late 1960s, like a man trying to perfect a recipe for pharmaceutical banana bread. He wanted something faster than Valium, something that hit harder and left quicker, something that would make anxiety shut up without making you sleep for 16 hours. He succeeded beyond anyone's wildest nightmares. Xanax works in about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's faster than a pizza delivery. You could be having a full-blown panic attack, take a pill, and by the time you've finished crying in your bathroom, the crying stops. Not because you've processed anything, not because you've grown as a person, because the drug has grabbed your brain's anxiety center and gently but firmly told it to take the rest of the day off. Your GABA receptors, the brain's natural chill-out system, suddenly have a new best friend who does all the work for them. It's like hiring someone to do your job while you watch. Feels great until you realise you've forgotten how to do the job yourself, and that's where the trap door opens. To understand why Xanax conquered America, you have to understand what anxiety actually feels like. Not stress, not worrying about deadlines. The real thing, the kind where your heart decides to audition for a drum solo at 3 a.m. for absolutely no reason. Where your chest tightens like someone's slowly sitting on it, but the someone is invisible and also might be death. Where your thoughts spin so fast you can't grab any single one, just watch them blur past like a slot machine that never stops on a winner. Millions of people live like this. They wake up like this. They go to work like this. They smile at co-workers while their nervous system screams that a saber-toothed tiger is definitely somewhere nearby, despite the fact that they work in accounting and the most dangerous thing in the office is the passive-aggressive emails from Karen in HR. The alarm system is broken, it won't stop ringing, and after enough years of false alarms, you do almost anything to make it stop. Enter Xanax stage left, with a cape and a promise. The first time Xanax works on someone with real anxiety, it feels like a miracle. Users describe it as the volume knob on my brain finally turning down, or like taking off a backpack I didn't know I was wearing, or more poetically, like God finally answered the phone. The racing stops, the dread dissolves. For 5 blessed hours, you feel like what you imagine normal people feel like all the time. Just fine, not ecstatic, not high, just fine. And for someone who hasn't felt fine in years, fine is the most intoxicating feeling in the world. The problem, of course, is that your brain notices. Your brain is a suspicious landlord who doesn't like unauthorized guests. It sees Xanax doing all this calming and thinks, why am I still paying for a GABA system if this new guy's handling everything? So it downgrades, closes some receptors, reduces its own chill-out production. If the pill's going to do the work, the brain figures, I'm going to take a vacation. This is tolerance. The dose that felt like a miracle last month now feels like a pleasant suggestion. So you take more, and then more, and then more. Each time your brain adjusts to the new normal, and the new normal requires more pills. You're not trying to get high. You're just trying to get back to zero. You're trying to feel anything other than the howling emptiness that shows up when the pills wear off. And when you try to stop, when the prescription runs out or the pharmacy gets suspicious, or you decide you want your brain back, withdrawal. Benzodiazepine withdrawal is special. Opioid withdrawal feels like dying. Benzo withdrawal can actually kill you. Your brain, having forgotten how to calm itself down, goes haywire. Seizures, hallucinations, the worst panic attacks of your life lasting days or weeks, as your nervous system throws a tantrum about having to do its own job again. Doctors recommend tapering off over months, sometimes years, slowly, carefully, like diffusing a bomb made of your own neurons. Most people don't taper. Most people just keep taking the pills. Because tomorrow's withdrawal is terrifying and today's dose is right there in the bottle. Now here's where the story gets distinctly American. Upjohn had a problem in 1981. The FDA wasn't excited about approving another benzodiazepine. Valium had already turned into a national scandal. Mother's little helper, the Rolling Stones called it. Housewives from coast to coast were swallowing it like candy and developing dependencies that made the medical establishment quietly nervous. The market for anxiety medication was crowded and getting controversial. So Upjohn did what any resourceful corporation would do when facing regulatory skepticism. They invented a disease. Not literally invented, more like aggressively promoted. Panic disorder existed as a concept, loosely in the psychiatric literature. But it wasn't a major diagnosis. It was a footnote, a subtype, something doctors occasionally mentioned but rarely emphasized. Upjohn decided panic disorder deserved the spotlight. They funded studies, lots of studies. They sponsored conferences where experts gave presentations about this serious undertreated condition called panic disorder that was ruining lives across America. They trained doctors to recognize it. They built awareness campaigns. They essentially created the market, then sold the solution. Among psychiatrists, panic disorder got a quiet nickname, the Upjohn illness. Nobody was quite sure if it was a real epidemic or a marketing campaign with a stethoscope. The smart money said both. The FDA approved Xanax in October 1981. Within 5 years, it was the most prescribed psychiatric medication in America. By 1986, doctors were handing it out for panic disorder, generalized anxiety, insomnia, muscle tension, nerves, and basically anything that could be described as patient seems stressed. The prescription pads never cooled down. The strategy worked so well it became a template. Create awareness of a condition, fund the research, train the doctors to spot it, then offer the solution you've been developing the whole time. Upjohn didn't just sell a pill, they sold a problem and a solution as a matched set. Like a pharmaceutical BOGO deal, America bought both. To understand Xanax's rise, you need to understand its predecessors, because pharmaceuticals have family trees just like dysfunctional humans. Before benzodiazepines, there were barbiturates, heavy sedatives that worked like a sledgehammer to the consciousness. The problem was the margin between calm and dead was terrifyingly thin. Marilyn Monroe died from barbiturates, Judy Garland too. So did thousands of people whose names never made headlines. The drugs worked exactly as designed. They just worked with no room for error. One pill too many, and you weren't anxious anymore because you weren't anything anymore. Then came a chemist named Leo Sternbach, working at a Swiss pharmaceutical company in 1955, who discovered benzodiazepines essentially by accident. He'd given up on the project. A colleague cleaning the lab found an untested compound in a drawer, tested it on mice, and watched them become the chillest mice in scientific history. The first benzodiazepine, Librium, hit the market in 1960. Valium followed in 1963. These were the wonder drugs of the mid-century, safer than barbiturates, harder to accidentally die from. They calmed you down without knocking you out cold. Doctors loved them. Patients loved them. By the 1970s, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America. Not most prescribed psychiatric drug. Most prescribed drug, period. Every anxious housewife, every stressed executive, every person who couldn't sleep got a prescription. It was the pharmaceutical equivalent of putting a bucket under a leak instead of fixing the roof, but the bucket worked beautifully and nobody wanted to talk about the roof. Then the backlash came, addiction reports, withdrawal horror stories. Patients who'd taken Valium exactly as directed for years finding themselves unable to stop. Congress held hearings. The FDA got nervous. The golden age of benzodiazepine started looking a little tarnished. Xanax arrived right on time. A new benzodiazepine for a new era. Faster acting, but shorter lasting. The implication was clear. This one's different. This one's better. This one won't hook you like Valium did. The implication was a lie. But it was a profitable lie. And in American pharmaceuticals, that's the only kind that matters. America in the 1990s was anxious. America in the 2000s was something else entirely. America in the 2010s was a nation with its collective nervous system, held together by prescriptions and prayer. The numbers tell the story like a horror film told in spreadsheets. Benzodiazepine prescriptions increased 67% between the mid-1990s and 2013. Xanax specifically went from 17.9 million prescriptions in 2004 to 28.9 million in 2013. That's a 61% increase in 9 years. By 2019, over 30 million American adults, 12.6% of the entire adult population, had used a benzodiazepine in the past year. 1 in 8 Americans was taking pills to feel less terrified of being alive. Why? What happened? Everything happened. That's what happened. The economy collapsed in 2008 and for most people never really came back. Millennials graduated into a job market that had evaporated like morning dew, except the morning lasted 15 years and the dew was their future. Student debt ballooned into numbers that looked like phone numbers. Buying a house became a fantasy, then a joke, then a bitter meme shared by people who'd given up on ever owning property. September 11th rewired the national psyche. Then came the wars that never ended. Then the terrorism alerts, colour-coded like a kindergarten project about fear. Then school shootings became so common they stopped making national news. Then social media arrived to ensure that every catastrophe, every tragedy, every piece of bad news from anywhere on Earth could be delivered directly to your pocket 24 hours a day, forever, with comments. Gen Z grew up doing active shooter drills in elementary school. They learned to hide under desks from hypothetical gunmen before they learned long division. They watched the planet warm and the adults argue about whether it was happening. They inherited a world that felt like it was ending and got told to be grateful for the opportunity. The anxiety wasn't irrational, that's the dark joke. The anxiety was the only rational response to the actual situation. The kids weren't broken, the world was broken, the kids were paying attention. Studies confirmed what everyone already knew. Gen Z reported higher anxiety levels than any generation ever measured. Teen depression increased 59% between 2007 and 2017. The most anxious generation in human history was coming of age. and they were looking for something, anything, to make the noise stop. Some found therapy. Therapy had wait lists. Some found exercise. Exercise required energy they didn't have. Some found meditation. Meditation required patience and a quiet room. Some found community. Community required leaving the house. A lot of them found pills. Pills just required a dealer. Here's where the story turns a corner and the body count starts. Hip-hop had always had drugs. Weed was practically mandatory. Cocaine had its era. Crack defined the late 80s and early 90s. Lean, that purple concoction of codeine cough syrup and Sprite that Houston invented and exported to the world, had been claiming rappers since DJ Screw died face down in his bathroom in 2000, with codeine in his blood and slowed down music still playing on his equipment. But lean had limitations. You needed prescription cough syrup, which meant doctors and pharmacies and connections. It was expensive, hard to get. And after enough rappers died, Big Mo in 2007, Pimp C the same year, even the Houston scene started getting cautious, or at least more careful about who was watching. Xanax was different. Xanax was about not feeling, not partying, not celebrating, not getting wild, just not feeling. Being so overwhelmed by existence that you needed pharmaceutical assistance just to get through Tuesday, and admitting that, in hip-hop, in a genre built on braggadocio and invincibility, that was new. The old guard rapped about being unstoppable, about wealth and power and women and winning. Admitting anxiety was admitting weakness. Admitting you needed pills to function was practically admitting defeat. 50 Cent didn't rap about panic attacks. Jay-Z didn't discuss his prescription history. The persona required confidence, even if the person underneath was falling apart. The new generation didn't care about the persona. They'd grown up on the internet sharing their feelings in public, watching mental health become a topic instead of a taboo. They rapped about depression, about wanting to die, about popping Xanax just to survive their own thoughts. The vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the point. It was the whole point. I found some Xanax in my bed. I took that shit and went back to sleep. That's Lil Peep, one of the founding fathers of what they'd call emo rap. He wasn't bragging. He wasn't glorifying. He was just describing his morning. This is what I do. This is how I cope. This is my life. Millions of kids heard that line and thought, same. The music gave permission. Permission to be anxious. Permission to medicate. Permission to admit that being alive in the 21st century was genuinely difficult. And nobody was okay. For a generation drowning in feelings they couldn't process, that permission felt like salvation. What nobody mentioned was the other thing Xanax gave them. A path to the morgue. Xanax by itself is relatively hard to overdose on. Emphasis on relatively. The distance between very high and dead is longer than with barbiturates or opioids. In a vacuum, with nothing else in your system, you'd have to take an absurd amount to actually stop breathing. But nobody takes drugs in a vacuum. And street Xanax isn't pharmaceutical Xanax. The demand was obvious. Anxious kids wanted bars. They wanted the white rectangles with Xanax stamped on them that they saw in music videos and Instagram posts. They wanted what Lil Peep was taking, what their favourite rappers referenced in every other song. They wanted quiet. The supply materialised because that's what supplies do when demand exists. Economics, meat pharmacology. Dealers bought pill presses online, bought powder from overseas, set up shop in basements and garages and stamped out tablets that looked exactly like the real thing, same shape, same colour, same Xanax 2 marking. A pharmacist would need a lab to tell the difference. Users just trusted some counterfeit bars actually contained alprazolam, the real stuff just from illicit sources, Those were the lucky ones. The pills worked. Everyone survived. Some contained other benzodiazepines, research chemicals with names like etizolum and clonazolum. Cheaper to source, similar effects but different potencies. Someone who knew their Xanax tolerance might accidentally overdose on something stronger without ever knowing the pill was different. Some contained random filler. Caffeine, baking soda, literally nothing. Those people got ripped off. At least they lived. And some contained fentanyl. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that kills in doses smaller than a grain of sand. The drug that had been quietly contaminating the street supply for years, turning every illicit pill into a game of Russian roulette played with invisible bullets. Someone buying what they thought was anxiety medication might actually be buying a lethal dose of opioid in disguise. They wouldn't know until they stopped breathing, or they'd never know because they'd be dead. This wasn't theoretical. This was happening. Across the country, in bedrooms and tour buses and anywhere else, young people were self-medicating their way through a world that gave them plenty to fear. Pills that looked identical to real Xanax were killing people who never intended to take an opioid at all. The street supply had become a minefield, and the kids were walking through it barefoot looking for peace. November 15th, 2017, Tucson, Arizona. A tour bus sits outside a concert venue. Engine quiet, curtains drawn. Inside, Gustav Orr is asleep. Well, that's what everyone assumes. He'd performed the night before in El Paso. The tour had been relentless. City after city, stage after stage. The kind of schedule that grinds down healthy people and absolutely destroys ones who are self-medicating their way through clinical depression. Gustav was 21 years old. He was known to millions as Lil Peep, a name he'd chosen because he was small and because his grandmother called him that. His face was covered in tattoos, including the words "Cry Baby" above his eyebrow and a broken heart on his cheek. His hair was dyed. His music mixed emo rock samples with trap beats, and his lyrics were basically a diary entry set to 808s. Depression, heartbreak, pills, wanting to die. The kids who listened saw themselves reflected back like a mirror held up to their own bathroom cabinets. He'd started self-medicating at 16 after his parents divorced. Weed first, then Xanax, then whatever else made the feeling stop. By the time he got famous, the drug use wasn't a secret. It was content. His Instagram was full of pills. His songs were full of pills. The pills were part of the brand, part of the aesthetic, part of the whole package. Before the show that night in Tucson, a fan had given him some Xanax bars. Free drugs from admirers. That was normal on tour. The gratitude economy of the diction. He took them. He always took them. His manager came to wake him for sound check. Knocked on the door. Got no response. Opened it. Gustav Orr wasn't asleep. Gustav Orr was dead. Had been for hours. The toxicology report came back weeks later. Alprazolam and fentanyl. The Xanax was real. But it wasn't just Xanax. The pills had been laced. Contaminated. He thought he was taking anxiety medication. He was actually taking a lethal dose of synthetic opioid. He didn't know. The fan who gave him the pills probably didn't know. Nobody knew until his lungs stopped working. He'd rapped about dying young. Had posted about taking Xanax that very day, hours before his death, like a man documenting his own ending in real time. He'd built a career on honesty about his self-destruction, and then the self-destruction won. The internet mourned, and then the internet kept popping bars. Because what else were they supposed to do? The anxiety was still there. The pills were still there. The music was still there, now with an extra layer of tragedy to make it hit even harder. Lil Peep became a martyr, a cautionary tale, and for some, proof that dying young was just part of the aesthetic. He wouldn't be the last, not by a long shot. Here's the thing about Xanax and hip-hop that nobody wants to say out loud. The music was documentary. These weren't rappers glorifying drugs for shock value. These were kids with clinical anxiety and depression, growing up in a world that felt like it was collapsing, self-medicating with whatever they could get their hands on, and then writing songs about it. The honesty wasn't marketing. The honesty was the whole point. For the first time in mainstream hip-hop, vulnerability wasn't weakness. Pain wasn't shameful. Needing help to get through the day was something you could say out loud, set to music, and upload for millions of people who felt the exact same way. The problem was that the documentation included the dying. The molecule doesn't care. That's the thing to remember. Alprazolam is just alprazolam. Same compound that Jackson Hester created in that Kalamazoo lab in 1981. It doesn't know if it's treating a suburban mum's panic attack or numbing a 21-year-old rapper on a tour bus in Arizona. It binds to GABA receptors. It suppresses neural activity. It does what it was designed to do. Everything else, the prescriptions, the addiction, the street supply, the fentanyl contamination, the deaths, the music that turned medication into mythology, all of that is human. Human choices. Human failures. Human kids trying to survive in a world that gave them every reason to be terrified and remarkably few tools to cope. Upjohn created a pill to treat panic. They called it Xanax. They marketed it brilliantly. They made billions. A generation found that pill and made it famous, rapped about it, posted about it, tattooed it on their faces. Then they started dying from it. Not because the pill was evil, because the street supply was poisoned, the mental health system was broken, and the same society that created their anxiety sold them pills instead of solutions. The bars are still out there. The fentanyl is still out there. The anxious kids are still out there, scrolling through phones that make them more anxious, living through a world that keeps giving them reasons to panic. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the SoundCloud rappers, before the fentanyl pills, before Lil Peep and Juice WRLD and the body count, there was Houston, there was Lean. There was a DJ named Robert Earl Davis Jr., who slowed music down to match the feeling of being medicated and accidentally invented an entire subculture. They called him DJ Screw. He died in 2000, face down in his studio bathroom, codeine in his blood. The first of many, and nobody stopped sipping. Because the music was too good, the high was too perfect, and the alternative, feeling everything all the time with no escape and no one to help, was unbearable. The pills promised peace. Sometimes they delivered silence. Sometimes the silence was permanent, and a generation was about to find out which kind they were getting. DJ Screw didn't invent drug rap. But he invented something more dangerous. A template. A blueprint for turning pharmaceutical escape into cultural identity, which in fairness has launched most bad ideas in music history. The template was simple. Feel too much. Medicate it away. Make art about the medication. Die from the medication. Become a legend. Elegant. Portable. Absolutely fatal. The kind of business model that looks great on paper until someone checks the obituaries. Screw built it in Houston using codeine cough syrup and slowed down beats. He invented a genre called chopped and screwed, music that sounded like someone had dunked a boombox in molasses and dared it to keep playing. The vocals stretched like taffy being pulled by someone who'd lost interest halfway through. The bass crawled. Critics said it was lazy. Critics missed the point so hard they should have received a participation trophy for effort. You don't listen to Chopped and Screwed to feel energized. You listen to it because time has been rude to you, and you'd like it to apologize by slowing down. He died in 2000, 29 years old. Heart gave out from years of lean, which is what happens when you marinate a vital organ in opioids and expect it to keep clocking in for work every morning. His collaborators followed: Big Mo, Pimp C, A parade of Houston legends who discovered that syrup doesn't care about your legacy, your talent, or how many people will miss you. The funerals kept happening. The culture responded with toasts, which is either tribute or recruitment depending on your level of cynicism. But lean had a problem that kept it regional. You actually had to get it. Prescriptions required doctors. Doctors required convincing. Pharmacies required connections that took years to build in Houston's particular ecosystem. The template was proven. The drug wasn't portable. You couldn't just FedEx the Houston pharmaceutical underground to every suburb in America. Then came a generation that inherited the template but couldn't get the syrup. They found Xanax instead. And Xanax was everywhere. In medicine cabinets between the Advil and the expired antibiotics nobody remembered buying. In purses next to the lip balm. In the hands of anyone whose doctor had heard the word anxiety and reached for a prescription pad like a reflex. Xanax was so available it had become ambient. The pharmaceutical equivalent of elevator music, except this actually worked. The platform that would change everything wasn't designed for music at all. SoundCloud launched in 2007 as a place for people to share audio files. Podcasters, comedians, DJs posting mixes. The founders probably imagined professionals using it for demos and collaborations, the audio equivalent of a LinkedIn nobody asked for. What they got instead was teenagers. Specifically, teenagers with laptops and feelings and absolutely no gatekeepers telling them they couldn't upload whatever they wanted. No A&R executives deciding if their music was marketable. No radio programmers determining if it fit a format. No managers, no labels, no adults in the room at all. Just an upload button and an algorithm that would either bless you with listeners or bury you in obscurity. And nobody really understood how it decided which. The kids who became SoundCloud Rap grew up in bedrooms. Florida bedrooms with humidity peeling the posters off walls like the house itself was sweating. Long Island bedrooms with views of parking lots and strip malls and the particular emptiness of American suburbs. California bedrooms, Texas bedrooms, bedrooms in places so aggressively average the GPS probably sighed when giving directions. They made music on laptops running pirated software, FL Studio mostly, cracked versions passed around like samizdat literature, tutorials watched on YouTube until 3 a.m. They recorded vocals into microphones that cost less than lunch at Chipotle. They learned production from the internet, which meant they learned production from other teenagers, who'd learned production from the internet, a chain of self-taught amateurs building an entire sound from collective ignorance and enthusiasm. The equipment was cheap because it had to be. These weren't kids with recording budgets or studio time or any of the resources that previous generations of artists had needed. They had bedrooms, they had laptops, they had feelings they needed to get out before the feelings ate them alive. That was enough. That had to be enough because it was all they had. They uploaded everything to SoundCloud because SoundCloud was the only venue that didn't check IDs, references, or whether you had any idea what you were doing. It was the open mic night that never closed, the talent show with infinite slots, the democratization of music distribution taken to its logical and chaotic conclusion. The algorithm was the great equalizer, except when it wasn't. SoundCloud's recommendation system was famously opaque. Nobody really knew why certain songs took off and others languished in obscurity. Artists would upload dozens of tracks and watch one randomly explode while the others gathered digital dust. There was no formula, no guaranteed path to success, just the endless lottery of the internet where going viral was possible for anyone and predictable for no one. This attracted a certain type of artist, not the ones who wanted traditional success, record deals, radio play, industry validation. Those kids were still sending demos to labels and getting rejected in the traditional way. SoundCloud attracted the kids who'd already given up on that path or never believed in it to begin with. The outsiders, the weirdos, the ones making music too strange or sad or experimental for anyone in a suit to understand. The sound that emerged was unlike anything hip-hop had produced before. It borrowed from everywhere. Trap beats from Atlanta, emo melodies from the 2000s, punk energy, goth aesthetics, the production, techniques of EDM, the emotional rawness of singer-songwriters. Genre boundaries dissolved because nobody was enforcing them. A track could have 8/8 drums and screamed vocals and guitar samples and auto-tuned crying, and nobody would tell you that wasn't allowed because there was nobody to tell you anything. The kids called it SoundCloud rap, or sometimes emo rap, or sometimes cloud rap, or sometimes just that sad shit, depending on who you asked and how pretentious they were feeling. The labels that would eventually sign these artists had no idea what to call it either. They just knew it was getting millions of plays from teenagers, and teenagers had credit cards attached to streaming accounts, and that was enough to matter. Gustav Orr was one of these kids. Grew up on Long Island, which is either a suburb of New York City or its own thing entirely, depending on how defensive the person from Long Island is feeling when you ask. His parents divorced when he was a teenager, which he handled the way a lot of teenagers handle divorce. Badly, dramatically, and with whatever substances were available to make the feelings less sharp. He started smoking weed. Then he found pills. Then he found that pills and weed together created a particular kind of numbness that felt almost like peace, if you squinted hard enough and didn't think about it too much. He started making music in his bedroom, the way everyone started making music. Laptop, pirated software, cheap microphone, uploaded tracks with titles like Star Shopping and Awful Things and The Way I See Things, the kind of titles that tell you exactly what you're getting before you press play. No false advertising, no pretense of happiness, just sadness, packaged neatly into 3-minute songs. He called himself Lil Peep, partly because his mum called him Peep when he was small, a nickname that stuck. Partly because he was still small as an adult, skinny, soft-faced, the kind of kid who looked like he should be studying for the S8s and arguing with his parents about curfew, not face tattooing his way through an underground rap career. The face tattoos were impossible to ignore, which was the point. Cry Baby inked above his eyebrow, a reference to the Johnny Depp movie, or just a description of his emotional state depending on who you asked. A broken heart on his cheek. Get Cake Die Young across his stomach, which everyone treated as aesthetic rather than prophecy, right up until it became prophecy. He looked like a notebook from detention had achieved sentience and decided to pursue a music career. Like someone had fallen asleep in a tattoo parlour and woken up as a mood board for teen depression. Every inch of visible skin was a diary entry. You didn't need to hear his music to understand him. You just needed to look at his face, which told you everything. This is a person in pain, and they want you to know it, and they're not going to pretend otherwise. Asked in an interview why he got so many tattoos, he shrugged like the question was slightly boring. I just wanted to be ugly, pause, or like different ugly, not regular ugly. That's the kind of answer that either means nothing or everything, depending on how much you've thought about being perceived, about wanting to mark yourself as separate from the normal world, about making your outside match how broken your inside feels. Here's the thing about Lil Peep that made him different from the Houston template. He wasn't bragging about the drugs. He wasn't celebrating. He was confessing. I got my Xanax, now I'm happy, he sang on one track. Sounds like an endorsement until you actually listen to the melody, which sounds like someone crying in a key signature. The words said happy. Everything else, the production, the delivery, the trembling autotune, said help, said please, said I'm drowning, and this is the only thing keeping me afloat. His Instagram was a pharmacy inventory set to a lifestyle aesthetic. Pills in his hand, pills on his tongue like communion wafers, pills scattered across surfaces like decoration, like someone had hired an interior designer whose only client reference was depression. He posted a video once showing off a bag of Xanax, grinning at the camera with the enthusiasm of a kid showing off Halloween candy. I could sell these, but I'm going to eat them. The comments were full of kids saying same and mood and fire emojis, which is what passes for concern in the age of social media. Nobody was calling a hotline. Nobody was staging interventions. They were hitting the heart button and moving on to the next post because that's how you interact with content. And his self-destruction had become content, indistinguishable from everything else in the feed. He wasn't hiding his addiction. He was live-streaming it, documenting his own slow-motion collapse in real time for an audience of millions who watched it the way you'd watch a reality show, with engagement but not intervention, with interest but not action. The music matched the Instagram. Trap beats slowed down until they dripped, drenched in reverb that made everything sound like it was happening underwater or in a dream you couldn't wake up from. Guitar samples lifted from the emo bands he'd grown up on. My Chemical Romance, the sad boy soundtrack of millennials, chopped up and repurposed for a new generation's despair. Vocals drenched in autotune, not to fix bad singing but to add texture, making his voice sound slightly less human, slightly more digital, disconnected from reality in exactly the way he felt disconnected from reality. I've been waiting for you my whole life, he sang on Star Shopping, one of his most popular tracks. I've been broken for the last time. Pretty melody, lush production. This sentiment was a suicide note set to a beat you could nod your head to. His fans heard it and thought, finally, someone's saying it. Someone admitting what it feels like to be young and terrified, and convinced the ending is coming sooner than the credits suggest. Someone who gets it. He wasn't alone. That was the thing. He was just the most visible symptom of a much larger condition. Lil Xan named himself after the drug directly, in case subtlety might accidentally survive the branding process. Real name, Diego Llanos. But Diego Llanos doesn't tell you anything about who he is or what he represents. Lil Xan tells you everything. It's a name that functions as warning label and mission statement simultaneously. Truth in advertising if the product being advertised was pharmaceutical dependence. He grew up in Redlands, California, a small city that's mostly notable for being close to larger cities that are actually notable. Started selling drugs as a teenager because that's what was available. Started taking them because that's what was around. Started making music because SoundCloud existed and he had a phone and feelings, which was the entire barrier to entry in 2016. His face was tattooed like someone had practiced on him while he was unconscious, and he'd woken up, checked the mirror, shrugged, and gone to get breakfast. Not artistic tattoos with meaning and careful placement. Scattered ink that looked accidental, chaotic. The visual equivalent of a room nobody had bothered to clean. His music sounded like it had been recorded underwater by someone who wasn't sure they wanted to be found. Blurry. Mumbled. The audio equivalent of a text sent at 4 a.m. that just says NVM. Betrayed was his breakthrough track. A song about a friend who'd stolen from him, set to a beat that sounded like Sadness had learned to play piano. The production was minimal. The lyrics were simple. The hook was just him mumbling about Xanax in a way that made millions of teenagers feel seen. It got tens of millions of plays. Columbia Records signed him before he'd proven he could make a second song that anyone cared about. Xanax really be helping me, he said in an interview, casual as describing his morning coffee. Like I need that shit to function. He said this on camera, to a journalist, as career advice. The interviewer asked if he worried about addiction. Lil Xan laughed like the question was naive. Bro, I'm already addicted. That's not a worry. That's just, like, the situation. That's the generation gap compressed into a single quote. Previous rappers bragged about being invincible, untouchable, immune to consequences. These kids bragged about being dependent, broken, held together by pharmaceuticals and spite. The flex wasn't strength. The flex was survival. I'm still here despite everything trying to kill me, including myself. Isn't that impressive? Isn't that something? The roster kept expanding because the demand kept expanding. Lil Pump emerged from Miami with a style that could generously be described as energetic, and more accurately described as a teenager yelling about drugs over bass-heavy beats. His breakout song, Gucci Gang, repeated the phrase Gucci Gang approximately 53 times in 2 minutes, which either made it the most annoying song of 2017 or a brilliant piece of minimalist pop art, depending on your tolerance for repetition and your willingness to take a teenager seriously. He got Xanax tattooed on his forehead with all the forethought of a sneeze. Just woke up one day and decided his face should advertise benzodiazepines permanently. When asked about it, he seemed genuinely surprised that anyone found it noteworthy. Like, yeah, it's on my forehead. So what? It's just a tattoo. It's just a drug. It's just my face. What's the big deal? The big deal presumably was that he was 17 years old and had just permanently marked himself as a billboard for a controlled substance. But nobody in his orbit seemed to think this was worth discussing, possibly because everyone in his orbit was also a teenager, and teenagers are not historically known for their long-term thinking about facial tattoos. Smoke Perp came up alongside Pump, part of the same Miami scene, the same collective of kids making music that sounded like what would happen if you gave a Sugar Rush child a bass synthesizer and no supervision. He once tweeted, "I love Lean more than I love myself," which was either a joke or a confession or both, and which nobody seemed to know how to respond to except with retweets. XXX Tentacion was something else entirely. His demons were darker, his past more complicated, his trajectory eventually ending not in overdose but in murder during a robbery in 2018. But before that ending, he was part of the same scene. SoundCloud uploads, face tattoos, raw emotional content that blurred the line between art and cry for help. "I don't want to die," he said once, in an interview that would be replayed endlessly after his death. "I just don't want to be alive." That's the kind of distinction that sounds like nonsense until it's the only thing that makes sense, until you felt the exhaustion of existence without wanting to actively end it, until you understand that sometimes the problem isn't wanting death, it's not wanting the particular life you've been handed. The record labels arrived like vultures who'd spotted a fresh carcass, except the carcass was still alive and making content. By 2016, the SoundCloud numbers had gotten too big to ignore. Kids with no industry connections were getting more streams than artists the labels had spent millions developing. The gatekeepers were being routed around. The old model, scout talent, develop it carefully, release music strategically, was being replaced by something messier and faster and completely outside their control. So they adapted, which in practice meant sign everyone, figure out who's profitable, drop the rest. Columbia signed Lil Xan, Warner signed Lil Peep, Interscope signed Lil Pump and Smoke Perp. The majors went shopping in the SoundCloud bargain bin, grabbing anyone with a few million streams and a willingness to sign a contract they probably didn't fully understand. The contracts were not, by most accounts, favourable to the artists. Standard major label deals rarely are, but these were especially tilted. The artists were young, 17, 18, 19 years old. They didn't have lawyers, they didn't have managers, or the managers they had were friends from high school who knew as much about the music industry as they did about neurosurgery. They saw dollar signs and the promise of legitimacy, and they signed whatever was put in front of them. The labels got catalogues. The artist got advances that felt like lottery winnings, but were actually loans against future earnings. Everyone pretended this was a fair exchange, the way everyone in the music industry has always pretended that exploiting young talent is just business. What the labels didn't do, what nobody seemed to think was their responsibility, was address the thing that made these artists popular in the first place. The drug use wasn't hidden, it was the brand. It was in the song titles and the lyrics and the Instagram posts and the face tattoos. These kids were self-destructing in public, documenting their addiction in real time, and the label's response was to monetize the documentation. Maybe there were conversations behind closed doors. Maybe A&R reps expressed concern in meetings that were never made public. But the public-facing reality was simple. The music was selling, the streams were climbing, and nobody was going to interrupt a revenue stream to suggest that maybe, possibly, someone should get help. The enabling wasn't malicious, it was just capitalism. The same system that had created the anxiety in the first place was now profiting from the coping mechanism, and asking it to intervene was like asking a casino to suggest that maybe you should stop gambling. Old hip-hop had rules, unwritten, but enforced with the enthusiasm of a homeowners association that really cares about lawn height. Rule 1. Invincibility. You had to be hard, untouchable, the kind of person bullets bounced off and problems couldn't stick to. 50 Cent got shot 9 times and rapped about it like the bullets had been rude, but not worth rescheduling brunch over. Jay-Z built an empire on the image of flawless execution, of having read the instruction manual for success while everyone else was still arguing about which way was up. Weakness was not permitted. Vulnerability was not an option. You won, or you pretended you were winning so convincingly that nobody could tell the difference. Rule 2. Never admit you needed help, especially not the pharmaceutical kind. Admitting you took Xanax to get through Tuesday was admitting defeat before the competition even started. It was saying, I can't handle what everyone else handles. I'm not built for this. I need a crutch. And in a genre built on superiority, my flow is better, my money is longer, my life is more impressive, admitting you needed chemical assistance was basically disqualification. The SoundCloud kids looked at these rules the way Sister Lucia looked at convent regulations, as suggestions written by people who didn't understand their situation and weren't worth taking seriously. They'd grown up on the internet where the rules were different, where oversharing was currency and vulnerability was content, where you got followers by being relatable, and nothing was more relatable than admitting you were struggling. Their feeds were full of people discussing anxiety and depression and medication, and getting rewarded for it. Likes, comments, the warm algorithmic glow of strangers who felt seen. Mental health had gone from shameful secret to trending topic somewhere in the 2010s. Celebrities talked about their therapists on talk shows, influencers posted about their medication. The stigma hadn't disappeared exactly, but it had transformed. Admitting you were struggling wasn't weakness anymore. It was authenticity. It was brand. So they rapped about being broken, about wanting to die, about needing pills just to make it from morning to night without the inside of their heads becoming uninhabitable. They weren't glorifying drug use in the traditional sense. No champagne showers, no celebrations of excess. They were documenting survival. This is what my life looks like. This is what I need to get through it. This is the truth nobody else was willing to say out loud. The honesty was the point. The vulnerability was the product. For kids who'd spent their entire lives being told to man up, toughen up, stop being so sensitive, stop making everything about your feelings. Here were artists saying, actually I'm falling apart and that's okay. And you're not alone if you're falling apart too. The music gave permission. Permission to be anxious. Permission to be medicated. Permission to admit that existing in this particular century was genuinely hard, and nobody had figured out how to do it gracefully. The fans weren't just listeners, they were participants in something that felt like community. In the comment sections of SoundCloud tracks, under Instagram posts, in dedicated subreddits and Discord servers, the kids who loved this music found each other. They shared their own stories, their own anxiety, their own pills, their own 3 a.m. thoughts that matched the lyrics they were hearing. They created fan art and memes and tribute videos. They formed the kind of parasocial bonds that the internet specializes in, where you feel like you know someone you've never met because you've consumed enough of their content. When an artist posted about taking Xanax, the comments weren't full of concern. They were full of solidarity. Same. Mood. This is me. Fire emojis and heart emojis and skull emojis. The language of internet communication applied to self-destruction with the same casual energy applied to everything else. Nobody seemed to think this was weird. Or rather, everyone knew it. It was weird, but weirdness had lost its power to shock. Everything was content now. Everything was shareable. A post about taking too many pills got the same engagement as a post about lunch, processed through the same interface, demanding the same response. Like, comment, scroll, repeat. The artist noticed. Of course they noticed. The drug content performed well. The sadness performed well. The more openly they struggled, the more engagement they got, the more their audience grew, the more they were rewarded for the very behaviour that was killing them. It was a feedback loop with a body count. Some of them probably understood what was happening. Some of them were probably too young or too addicted or too deep in the algorithm to see it clearly. Some of them might have wanted to stop, to post something different, to be a person instead of a brand. But the brand was what paid the bills, and the brand required a constant supply of content about pills and pain and barely surviving, so they kept posting. And the fans kept engaging, and the numbers kept climbing. And somewhere underneath all of it, real people were really struggling, and nobody could tell where the performance ended and the genuine crisis began. The aesthetic was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. It was also unavoidable. That was the point. Face tattoos everywhere. Not the clean kind that celebrities got from expensive artists in sterile studios with mood lighting. Chaotic scribblings that looked like someone had fallen asleep at a party and woken up permanently altered. Teardrops under eyes. Broken hearts on cheeks. Words like sad and doom inked where job interviewers couldn't miss them, which was fine. Because these kids weren't going to job interviews. They weren't playing that game. They weren't pretending to have 5-year plans or retirement accounts, or any of the normal markers of people who expected to stick around long enough to need them. The tattoos were commitment devices. Once you've marked your face permanently, you've closed certain doors. Normal job, gone. Blended into a crowd, gone. The ability to pretend you're not who you appear to be, gone. The face tattoos said, "This is who I am, and I'm not going back, and if that limits my options, at least it makes the remaining options clear." The fashion matched the fatalism. Oversized everything. Thrift store finds layered without coordination, like getting dressed was an afterthought that happened on the way to something more important, or less important, or nothing at all. Designer logos were out. That was old hip-hop, the flaunting of success. Looking like you'd just woken up from a nap you didn't remember starting was in. Looking like you'd given up in an aesthetically interesting way. The hair was dyed in colours that didn't occur in nature. Pink, purple, silver. Combinations that suggested either careful planning or chemical accident. Lil Peep's hair changed constantly. A different colour in every era, like he was documenting the passage of time through follicle experimentation. The overall effect was somewhere between rock star and runaway and walking cry for help, which again was the point. These weren't artists trying to look successful. They were artists trying to look like how they felt, and how they felt was broken, and broken had a particular visual language they were developing in real time. The music sounded like it felt to be them. Beats that dripped with reverb, slowed down until they oozed rather than bounced. Bass that hit your chest like a physical presence. Hi-hats that skittered nervously, the percussion equivalent of anxious fingers tapping a table. The production style owed debts to Houston's chopped and screwed sound, to Atlanta's trap music, to the emo bands of the 2000s, to EDM, to whatever else the producers had absorbed through years of internet listening. Genre didn't exist in the way it used to. Everything was available. Everything could be sampled. Everything could be combined. Vocals drenched in auto-tune, not to correct pitch, but to add texture. To make human voices sound slightly less human. To create a layer of digital distance between the singer and the listener, as if the emotions were being transmitted through a damaged phone line. The auto-tune became a stylistic signature. The T-Pain innovation, stripped of its original joy and repurposed for sadness. Lyrics that read like diary entries from someone who'd made peace with not seeing 30. Not metaphorical, not dressed up in clever wordplay, just, I took pills today. I wanted to die. I miss you. I hate myself. The directness was the point. Previous generations of rappers had competed on complexity. Who could construct the most intricate rhyme schemes, deploy the cleverest references? These kids competed on emotional rawness. Who could be the most honest about the most painful things? Who could strip away the artifice and just bleed on the track? Juice WRLD freestyled for an hour straight on a radio show once. No breaks, no written lyrics, just an hour of whatever was in his head, poured out like he was afraid it might disappear if he stopped. The host looked stunned. The internet lost its mind. A kid that young shouldn't have that much pain stored up and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. But he did. They all did. That was the point. The music wasn't performance in the traditional sense. It was pressure release. These kids were full of something that needed to come out, and if it came out as songs instead of something worse, that was the best outcome anyone could hope for. By 2017, SoundCloud had produced a whole roster of stars who rapped about pills like sponsors, posted their drug use like lifestyle content, and built entire identities around being too broken to function unmedicated. Lil Pump, who'd graduated from yelling about Gucci Gang to yelling about everything else, his forehead tattoo fading slightly but still legible, still advertising a substance he may or may not have still been taking. Smoke Perp riding alongside him, the two of them forming a chaotic partnership that looked like what would happen if you gave ADHD a record deal. Lil Xan quieter and sadder, his music more introspective, his addiction more visible in the gaunt face and the mumbled interviews. XXX Tentacion, whose darkness went deeper than pills. Domestic violence allegations, assault charges, a history that made him controversial even within a scene that didn't really do controversy. His death would come by gunshot, not overdose, but his presence loomed over the era, a reminder that the pain these artists were processing wasn't always just chemical. And Gustav Orr, Lil Peep, who'd built the most devoted fan base of any of them by being the most nakedly honest about wanting to vanish, whose music sounded like a goodbye letter set to a beat, whose face told you everything, whose Instagram documented a spiral in real time for anyone who wanted to watch. They were kids. That's the thing that gets lost when they become cautionary tales, when they get reduced to statistics or symbols or arguments about the state of hip-hop. 19 years old, 20, 21. They'd been legal adults for maybe 2 years, famous for less. They had developing brains and unlimited access to substances and millions of fans who loved them precisely for being damaged and absolutely no institutional support for being anything else. The label saw dollar signs. The streaming platforms saw engagement metrics. The fans saw themselves reflected back for the first time, saw artists who understood what it felt like to be young and terrified and convinced that the world was broken and you were broken too. Nobody seemed to notice the obvious problem. Or maybe everyone noticed and nobody wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would be complicated and expensive and might interrupt the revenue stream. The obvious problem was this: you can't build a culture around pharmaceutical escape without eventually escaping somewhere nobody can follow. You can't make self-destruction your brand without eventually reaching the self-destruction part. You can't sing about dying young every day and expect to die old. The music gave permission. The culture gave identity. The pills gave peace. What nobody mentioned, what nobody wanted to think about, was where all that permission eventually led. The answer was coming. It was already on its way. It was in a tour bus in Arizona, in a private jet over Chicago, in bedrooms and bathrooms and all the places where kids thought they were alone with their pain and their pills. But that's the next part of the story. For now the music was playing, the streams were climbing, the bars were being swallowed, and somewhere a kid who'd never met any of these artists was discovering that if you took enough Xanax, the noise in your head finally stopped. That discovery felt like salvation. It was about to start feeling like something else. The pills that killed Lil Peep weren't pharmaceutical. They looked pharmaceutical. Same white rectangle, same Xanax 2 stamped on the surface, same promise of 15 minutes to silence. But somewhere between the factory in Kalamazoo and the tour bus in Tucson, the supply chain had taken a detour through someone's basement, and what came out the other end wasn't Xanax at all. It was fentanyl pressed into a familiar shape. A wolf in sheep's clothing, except the wolf was microscopic, and the sheep was a pill, and the person swallowing it had no idea they were playing Russian roulette with a gun they couldn't see. This is where the story stops being about culture and starts being about chemistry. And chemistry, unlike culture, doesn't care about your aesthetic. The counterfeit pill market exists because economics exists. Millions of anxious kids want Xanax without appointments or prescriptions or awkward conversations with doctors. Pharmacies are stingy. Prescriptions are hard to get. The gap between what people want and what they can legally get is called an opportunity if you're an entrepreneur. It's called a death sentence if you're a customer. Sometimes it's both. Pill presses cost a few $1,000s online. Powder could be sourced from overseas. With the right setup, someone working alone in a basement could produce thousands of pills a day, each one stamped to look identical to the real thing. The quality control was, to put it generously, inconsistent. To put it accurately, there was more oversight at a lemonade stand. Some pills contained real alprazolam. Some contained research chemicals with names like etizolam and flualprazolam, names that sound like rejected Star Wars planets. Some contained nothing useful at all. Caffeine, baking soda, whatever was lying around. Those customers got ripped off, which is annoying, but not fatal. Congratulations, you got robbed instead of killed. Silver linings. And some pills contained fentanyl. Fentanyl is the nuclear option of opioids, a synthetic painkiller 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, designed for cancer patients and end-of-life care. Finding it in your Xanax is like ordering a glass of wine and getting handed a flamethrower. The margin between effective and dead is so thin you could lose it between couch cushions. And the people pressing pills in garages weren't exactly measuring with laboratory precision. They were eyeballing it. It's like baking, except instead of some cookies being slightly crunchier than others, some of them kill people. The result is a lottery. Every street pill is a ticket. Most tickets are blanks, some are prizes, and some are death sentences disguised as anxiety medication, waiting patiently in a plastic bag for someone to swallow them without knowing they've just made the last decision of their life. The odds were never posted. The house always wins, and the house doesn't even know it's playing. Gustav Orr had been on tour for weeks when his bus pulled into Tucson, city after city, stage after stage, the kind of schedule that would exhaust a healthy person and absolutely demolish someone who was self-medicating their way through clinical depression with the help of whatever substances fans threw at him during shows. Because fans threw substances at him during shows. That was a thing that happened. Bags of Xanax, cocaine, other pills, lobbed onto the stage like offerings to a god of sadness. Admiration expressed through pharmaceuticals, connection achieved through shared intoxication. It was the weirdest possible version of throwing flowers at a performer, except the flowers could kill you. He was 21 years old, famous in that strange internet way where millions of people knew his face, but he could still walk through most airports unrecognised by anyone over 30. He had "Get Cake Die Young" tattooed on his stomach, which everyone had treated as aesthetic rather than prophecy. He had a catalogue of songs about dying young, which everyone had treated as art rather than warning. He had an Instagram full of pills, which everyone had treated as content rather than cry for help. The signs were everywhere. Nobody read them, or everyone read them and decided they were just vibes. In the days before that show in Tucson, things weren't good. He'd told people he was spiralling. Friends were concerned. His mental state was deteriorating faster than his schedule allowed him to address. He reportedly wanted to cancel the Tucson show, too exhausted, too overwhelmed, too deep in the hole to climb out and perform. According to later court documents, he was told he could only cancel if he was sick. Insurance reasons, contract obligations. The machinery of touring doesn't stop because one person is falling apart. So he took Xanax to make himself appear sick enough to cancel. The logic made sense if you were 21 and desperate and didn't know the pills you were taking weren't what they claimed to be. A fan had given him the pills. Or maybe someone else had. The investigation never reached a definitive conclusion. Someone gave him something. He took it. He'd taken similar things hundreds of times before. The ritual was as familiar as any other part of his routine. He went to sleep on the tour bus, probably assuming he'd wake up in a few hours. Tomorrow would come and he'd figure it out then. Tomorrow didn't come. Not for him. His manager found him the next morning. Still. Cold. The kind of stillness that doesn't need a medical degree to interpret. Gustavor had been dead for hours while the bus sat in a parking lot and the crew slept nearby, and nobody knew that the kid in the back had stopped breathing. The toxicology report confirmed what everyone had started to suspect. Alprazolam and fentanyl. He thought he was taking anxiety medication. He was actually playing the lottery and his ticket came up death. He'd posted on Instagram hours before he died. A picture of the pills. A joking caption about how many he was taking. The last documentation of a life that had been documented so thoroughly that even the ending was captured in real time. The investigation that followed was extensive and ultimately unsatisfying, which is a polite way of saying lots of people worked very hard and nobody went to prison. The Tucson Police Department worked the case. The DEA got involved. Fentanyl deaths attracted federal attention, especially when the victim was famous enough to generate headlines. Tips came in. People were interviewed. The supply chain was examined from multiple angles. Paperwork was filed. Meetings were held. All the things that happen when institutions want to look like they're doing something. Nobody was ever charged. The investigation closed without reaching a definitive conclusion about where the fentanyl came from. Maybe it was the fan who handed him pills. Maybe it was someone else entirely. Maybe the pills passed through multiple hands before reaching him, each person in the chain unaware of what they were actually distributing. The chain of custody was too murky, the evidence too circumstantial, the burden of proof too high to clear. Under federal law, Distributing fentanyl that causes death can carry a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. In theory, whoever gave Lil Peep those pills could spend decades in prison. In practice, prosecutors need to prove who did it, and probably that person isn't the same as definitely that person beyond reasonable doubt. The law requires certainty. Reality provided ambiguity. Ambiguity won. So nobody went to prison. The person who handed him the pills, whoever that was, faced no legal consequences. The death was ruled accidental. Case closed. Justice did that thing where it shrugs and looks at its shoes and says, "We tried." Gustavor's mother did not move on. Lisa Womack filed her lawsuit in October 2019, nearly 2 years after her son died on a tour bus in Arizona. She sued First Access Entertainment, the management company that had guided Lil Peep's career. She sued the tour manager, Belinda Mercer. She sued Chase Ortega, who had helped manage her son. She wanted answers, accountability, something other than accidental death and a closed case file. The allegations painted a picture of an operation that prioritized revenue over the person generating it. According to court filings, Lil Peep had been stressed, overwhelmed, burnt out, exhausted and physically unwell during the tour. His managers allegedly pushed him onto stage after stage in city after city, plying and propping him up with whatever it took to keep the shows going. The lawsuit claimed that tour personnel had provided drugs to artists and crew, creating an environment where substance abuse wasn't just tolerated but enabled. The touring industry's unofficial motto, "The show must go on, and if the performer needs chemical assistance to make that happen, well, that's showbiz." A member of Lil Peep's, of collective goth boy clique, provided a declaration claiming that the tour manager provided and supplied Xanax, cocaine, marijuana, Percocet and ketamine to people on the tour bus. Another allegation suggested that when Peep wanted to cancel the Tucson show, he was told to make himself appear sick by taking Xanax, advice that, if true, directly contributed to his death. Career Guidance, 2017 edition. Feel bad? Take drugs. Feel too bad to perform? Take more drugs? What could go wrong? First Access Entertainment denied everything. Their response was categorical. The claim that anyone under their auspices was somehow responsible for, complicit in, or contributed to his death is categorically untrue. They argued they had consistently encouraged Peep to stop abusing drugs. The "we told him not to" defense, legally sound, morally questionable, emotionally satisfying to no one. Their legal argument was more interesting than their denial. The management company argued that holding them responsible for a client's drug overdose would extend the boundaries of legal obligations far beyond any precedent. It would, they claimed, convert businesses engaged in the music and entertainment industries into full-time babysitters for artists. Babysitters? That was the word they used. The legal position was essentially, we're not responsible for keeping our 21-year-old client alive, even if we allegedly created conditions that contributed to his death. That's not what management companies do. Apparently, duty of care only extends to making sure the check's clear. The judge disagreed with some of their arguments. The fact that defendants didn't give the decedent adequate protection for that environment, I think that could add up to causation here, she said during one hearing. The case was going to trial. Someone was going to have to answer questions under oath. Then, in February 2023, after 4 years in the court system, the lawsuit settled. Terms undisclosed, no admission of wrongdoing, no precedent set for future cases. Just a quiet resolution, a check written, and everyone moving on with their lives. Except, of course, for Gustav, who didn't have a life to move on with. The music industry learned nothing from the lawsuit. because the lawsuit didn't teach anything. No verdict, no published findings, no legal standard that future managers would have to meet. Just a settlement that everyone agreed not to discuss, and a dead artist whose catalogue kept generating revenue for everyone involved. The machine kept running. The machine always keeps running. Mac Miller's death was different, not better. There's no good version of a 26-year-old dying from drugs he didn't know would kill him, but different in ways that mattered legally, different in ways that meant someone would actually face consequences. Malcolm James McCormick died on September 7th, 2018 in his home in Studio City, Los Angeles. Unlike Lil Peep, who died on tour surrounded by staff and crew, Mac died alone. His assistant found him the next morning unresponsive. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose. Fentanyl, cocaine, and alcohol. A cocktail that stopped his heart while he slept. The fentanyl came from counterfeit oxycodone pills. Mac had texted a dealer named Cameron Pettit on September 4th, asking for blues, the street term for 30mg oxycodone pills, plus cocaine and Xanax. Pettit agreed. He made the delivery in the early morning hours of September 5th. 2 days later, Mac was dead. The pills Pettit delivered weren't oxycodone. They were counterfeits, pressed with fentanyl instead of the pharmaceutical opioid Mac thought he was buying. He snorted them, not knowing the powder contained something 50 times more potent than what he expected. His tolerance was calibrated for one drug. His lungs got another. His body did the math and came up short. Unlike the Lil Peep case, investigators could trace the supply chain. Pettit got the pills from a man named Ryan Michael Revis. Revis got them from Stephen Andrew Walter. 3 links in a chain, each one identifiable, each one documented through text messages and transactions, and the digital trail that drug deals leave in the modern era. Turns out criminals aren't great at operational security. The DEA arrested all 3. The prosecutions took years, the way federal cases do, but they ended in convictions, which is more than most fentanyl deaths get, which is more than Lil Peep's family got. Stephen Walter, the top of the supply chain, pleaded guilty to distribution of fentanyl. He was 49 years old, a former dog groomer who'd pivoted to more profitable work. The career counsellors never warn you about this particular pivot. At his sentencing, he tried to minimise his role. He claimed he didn't know the pills were going to Mac Miller. He thought he was selling to Pettit for personal use. He didn't know anyone would die. The judge wasn't impressed. Prosecutors presented evidence that Walter had continued selling counterfeit pills even after Mac's death, fully aware that fentanyl was killing people. He'd kept dealing for almost a year before his arrest, knowing the risks, calculating that the profits outweighed the possibility of consequences. That's not ignorance. That's indifference. The court has elected not to accept that plea agreement, the judge said, rejecting the 17-year deal Walter's lawyers had negotiated. He got 17.5 years instead, an extra 6 months that probably felt symbolic to everyone except Walter. Ryan Revis, the middleman, got 10 years and 11 months. At his sentencing, he told the court he didn't know the pills contained fentanyl. He was just the delivery guy. He found out Mac Miller was dead when he got arrested a year later. This is not just a regular drug case, Revis said at sentencing. Somebody died, and a family is never going to get their son back. He was right. A regular drug case doesn't involve a Grammy-nominated artist whose mother has to write a victim impact statement about the son she'll never see again. My life went dark the moment Malcolm left his world. Karen Myers wrote, Malcolm was my person, more than a son. He would never knowingly take a pill with fentanyl, ever. He wanted to live and was excited about the future. He wanted to live. That's the line that sticks, not a suicide. not someone who'd given up, a person who wanted to be alive, who had plans and projects and a future he was looking forward to, who trusted that the drugs he bought were the drugs he was getting. The trust was misplaced. The future never came. Cameron Pettit, the dealer who actually handed Mac the pills, eventually pleaded guilty too. The whole supply chain held accountable. It only took 5 years, 3 deaths, 3 different legal outcomes. Lil Peep, no criminal charges, civil lawsuit settled quietly, no accountability. Mac Miller, 3 dealers convicted, combined sentences of nearly 40 years. Accountability, sort of, years after the fact. Juice WRLD, no one to charge. He swallowed the pills himself. The pattern, if there is one, seems to be luck. Not justice. Luck. Whether anyone faces consequences depends on whether investigators can trace the supply chain, whether evidence survives, whether anyone was dumb enough to leave text messages on their phone. Most fentanyl deaths don't result in prosecutions. Most families don't get victim impact statements read at courtrooms. Most cases close with accidental overdose and a file that gathers dust. The dealers who killed Mac Miller will spend decades in prison. The person who killed Lil Peep, whoever that was, faced no consequences at all. The universe doesn't distribute justice evenly. It just distributes death and leaves the sorting to systems that weren't built for this scale of catastrophe. Jared Higgins was 20 when Mac Miller died, 21 when he became one of the biggest artists in the world, 21 when he died on a tarmac in Chicago, which meant he'd had exactly 1 year to be both famous and legally old enough to drink. The timeline was absurd. The talent was real. The ending was predictable to everyone except the person living it. He'd been making music since high school, uploading to SoundCloud, building a following the way everyone in his generation did. 1 stream at a time, 1 fan at a time, 1 confession set to a beat at a time. He called himself Juice WRLD, the name a reference to Tupac's movie Juice and the idea of influence, of power, of having something people wanted. His music was different from Peep's. Faster, more melodic, built on hooks that stuck in your head and lyrics that stuck in your heart. He could freestyle for an hour without stopping, pulling words from some internal reservoir that seemed bottomless and inexhaustible and deeply, profoundly sad. He didn't just have feelings, he had an industrial supply of them, and he seemed determined to convert every last one into content before they converted him into a statistic. Lucid Dreams broke through in 2018, the year Mac Miller died and the year after Lil Peep died. It sampled Sting, sounded like a pop song, and was actually about using drugs to cope with heartbreak, about being trapped in memories you couldn't escape, about wanting to feel nothing because feeling something hurt too much. It went to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. The kid from Chicago was suddenly everywhere. He was also, by every available account, addicted to everything. Lean, Percocet, Xanax, codeine, oxycodone. Whatever was available, whatever was offered, whatever made the noise stop for a few hours. He rapped about it constantly, not bragging exactly, but not hiding either. The same documentary impulse that had defined his predecessors. This is what my life looks like. This is what I need to get through it. This is the truth. I'm not trying to glorify it, he said in an interview when someone asked about all the drug references in his music. I'm just telling my truth. His truth involved enough opioids and benzodiazepines to concern everyone around him. His management worried. His label worried. The people who loved him watched him spiral and didn't know how to make it stop. He was 20 years old and worth millions of dollars and surrounded by people who either couldn't or wouldn't say no to him. Money buys a lot of things. Apparently it doesn't buy intervention. He'd watched Lil Peep die, referenced it in songs, seemed to understand intellectually that his path had a predictable destination, made music about dying young, the way Peep had made music about dying young. Understanding and changing are different verbs. Knowing the cliff is there doesn't stop you from walking toward it if you can't see any other direction to go. 2 years after Lil Peep died on a tour bus in Tucson, Juice WRLD landed at Chicago's Midway Airport on a private jet from Los Angeles. The flight had been normal. The landing was normal. What wasn't normal was the federal agents waiting on the tarmac, which suggested that someone's day was about to get significantly worse. The FBI had received a tip: guns and drugs on the plane. Enough to warrant a search, possibly arrests, definitely a very uncomfortable conversation with people in suits who had the authority to make your life extremely difficult. This was supposed to be a bust, not a tragedy. The agents were there to make arrests, not call paramedics. As the plane taxied toward the private terminal, Jared Higgins started swallowing pills. Percocets, reportedly. Oxycodone. A lot of them. Enough to trigger a seizure before the federal agents could even board the aircraft. The logic made a terrible kind of sense if you were panicking and not thinking clearly about pharmacology. Swallow the evidence. No pills in your possession means no arrest for pills in your possession. The consequences of a federal drug charge versus the consequences of ingesting a massive quantity of opioids all at once. In the moment, facing the immediate threat, the calculation might have seemed reasonable. It's the kind of plan that might work in a movie, where protagonists have plot armor and consequences are negotiable, and bodies can absorb whatever the script requires. In reality, on a tarmac in Chicago, Jared Higgins seized on the floor of his private jet, while federal agents watched and paramedics rushed to help, and nobody could do anything about the pills already dissolving in his stomach, doing exactly what they were designed to do except all at once instead of spread across hours. He was transported to a hospital. He was pronounced dead within the hour, 21 years old, same age as Lil Peep when he died. Different circumstances, different pills, different chain of causation. Same result. The substances won again. They always win eventually. The aftermath revealed the scale of what had been travelling with him. 70 pounds of marijuana on the plane, multiple firearms, a quantity of controlled substances sufficient to explain the federal interest. This wasn't personal use. This was inventory. A touring artist moving with an entourage and a supply chain, treating drugs like merchandise, like equipment, like just another line item on the tour budget. The pills he swallowed were opioids, not benzos. But the distinction felt academic at that point. He'd been mixing substances for years. Lean and Xanax and Percocet and whatever else was available, combined in quantities that would have killed a less tolerant user long before. His body had adapted to doses that should have been fatal. It had learned to survive what should have killed it, over and over, until one morning it couldn't adapt anymore. Unlike Peep's death, there was no one to charge. Unlike Mac's death, there was no supply chain to trace. Juice WRLD had killed himself accidentally in a moment of panic, trying to avoid consequences that turned out to be less severe than the solution. You can't prosecute someone for their own terrible decision. You can only bury them and wonder if it could have gone differently. Legends never die. His posthumous album came out the following year, debuted at number 1. It contained songs about drugs and pain and dying young, recorded before his death and released after, like listening to a ghost explain how he'd become one. The streaming numbers were enormous. The title was either tribute or marketing or both. The music industry has never been great at distinguishing between grief and opportunity. Why choose when you can have both? His estate has released multiple posthumous albums since. The catalogue keeps growing. The revenue keeps flowing. The dead artist keeps producing value for everyone who survived him. The machine doesn't stop. The machine never stops. They weren't the only ones. They were just the famous ones. Mac Miller died in September 2018. Lil Peep had died 11 months earlier. Juice WRLD would die 15 months later. 3 deaths in a window of about 2 years, each one generating headlines and think pieces and moments of collective mourning. But the overdose crisis wasn't limited to people with record deals. For every famous death, there were thousands of anonymous ones. Kids in bedrooms who never got discovered. Fans who absorbed the aesthetic without the safety net of handlers and money. They died in 1s and 2s, in overdoses ruled accidental, in apartments where nobody found them for days. The famous deaths were tragedies. The anonymous deaths were statistics. Both were equally dead. The fentanyl didn't check credentials, didn't verify streaming numbers, didn't care whether you had talent or connections or a future that might have meant something. It just did what chemistry does, which is react. Sometimes the reaction was survivable, sometimes it wasn't. XXXTentacion died in June 2018, though not from drugs. He was shot during a robbery, a different kind of American tragedy. But his death added to the weight of that era. Another young face gone, another funeral, another name on a list that kept growing longer. By 2020, everyone knew the pills were dangerous. The warnings had been issued. The think pieces had been written. The funerals had been attended and live-streamed and hashtagged. Awareness had been raised. The pills kept killing people anyway, because knowing and stopping are different things. Because the anxiety that drove kids to the pills in the first place hadn't gone away. If anything, the pandemic made it worse. Isolation, economic collapse, a world that felt like it was ending in real time, with nowhere to go and nothing to do except sit alone with your thoughts. The supply was more contaminated than ever. Buying street pills in 2020 was more dangerous than it had been in 2017. The game kept getting deadlier. The players kept playing, because the alternative, feeling everything, all the time with no escape, felt worse than the risk. DJ Screw's template was still running, 2 decades after his death. Feel too much, medicate. Make art about it. Die from it. Become legend. The only thing that had changed was the tempo. Lean killed you slowly, over years. The fentanyl supply killed fast without warning, one wrong pill, and the story ends mid-sentence. The funerals came quicker now. The legends were minted younger. The cycle showed no signs of slowing down, and somewhere, in bedrooms and tour buses and all the private spaces where people are alone with their pain and their pills, the next names on the list were still taking chances. Still hoping to be the exception to a rule that had never made exceptions. The harvest wasn't over, it was just getting started. The irony of Lil Xan getting sober is almost too perfect to be real. The kid who named himself after the drug, who tattooed his face like a pharmaceutical advertisement, who built an entire career on being too anxious to function without alprazolam, who told an interviewer with the casual confidence of someone describing their breakfast routine, "Bro, I'm already addicted. That's not a worry, that's just, like, the situation." That kid checked into rehab in 2019, got clean, and started telling everyone who would listen that Xanax had almost killed him. He even changed his name back to Diego, his actual name, like he was trying to shed a skin that had gotten too tight, too dangerous, too associated with a version of himself that had been slowly dying in public for years. The face tattoos couldn't be undone. Those were permanent reminders of decisions made at 19. But the name he could take back. "I was a zombie," he said in an interview describing his Xanax years. "I wasn't even there. I was just not there." Which, if you think about it, was exactly the point. That's what Xanax does. That's what it's designed for. It makes you not there. Takes the part of your brain that won't stop screaming and turns down the volume until you can function. The problem is that function and live aren't the same thing, and somewhere along the way Diego had confused being numb with being okay. A lot of people make that mistake. Most of them don't have millions of followers watching them make it in real time. He started speaking against the drug he'd once promoted, did interviews about addiction, warned kids not to follow his example, posted about recovery the same way he'd once posted about getting high, because in the attention economy, your transformation is just another form of content. Sobriety has an aesthetic too. It's just less photogenic than self-destruction. The guy who'd made Xanax cool was now trying to make it uncool, which is a bit like Ronald McDonald announcing he's vegan. The message might be sincere, but the messenger has credibility issues. When your entire brand was built on pharmaceutical dependence, pivoting to pharmaceutical abstinence requires the audience to believe in a version of you they've never seen before. Some believed him, some didn't. The streaming numbers for his old music didn't go down either way. Kids were still listening to Betrayed and all the other tracks where he'd rapped about bars like they were vitamins. The culture had absorbed the warning and kept doing what it was doing anyway, because that's what culture does. It takes your cautionary tale and turns it into content. It files your redemption arc next to your destruction arc and lets the algorithm decide which one gets more engagement. He wasn't the only one who survived. That's worth remembering, even if the survivors make for less dramatic stories than the deaths. Lil Pump, the kid who'd gotten Xanax tattooed on his forehead with all, the forethought of a sneeze, went through his own transformation, started hitting the gym in 2019, posted about quitting lean, quitting the heavy drug use that had defined his public image for years. By 2023 he was flexing workout progress photos and telling interviewers that fitness was his new addiction. I stopped smoking, I stopped sipping lean, and I started focusing on myself, he said, because I was tired of looking at myself, chubby as fuck. I was just looking at myself and I looked pregnant and I just hated that shit. Motivational speaking, SoundCloud edition. Tony Robbins could never. His version of sober wasn't exactly clinical sobriety. He still drank, still smoked weed occasionally, but it was a dramatic reduction from the person who'd once seemed determined to consume every substance available before his 21st birthday. The Xanax tattoo on his forehead started getting covered up. Longer hair, hats, strategic angles in photos. Like the word had become embarrassing rather than edgy, a reminder of a version of himself that no longer fit whatever brand he was building now. I was on a lot of drugs back then, he said in a 2023 interview, with the tone of someone describing a past life. I used to smoke at least 4 ounces a day. Now I'm not even smoking a blunt a day. Now I'm sober, I'm just chilling. The transformation was real, or at least real enough to document. Whether it would last, whether any of these recoveries would last, was a question nobody could answer. Addiction doesn't care about your Instagram posts, or your gym selfies, or your public declarations of changed behaviour. It waits. It's patient. It doesn't unfollow you. It's always there, ready to reclaim anyone who gets too confident about having escaped. But for now at least, Lil Pump was alive. 24 years old, which sounds young until you remember he was 17 when Gucci Gang went viral. 7 years in the industry. A lifetime in internet time. He'd outlived the era that created him. That's more than some people got. Smoke Perp, who'd once tweeted, "I love lean more than I love myself," kept a lower profile as the years passed, still making music, still touring, still around, which in the context of his generation was its own kind of achievement. The tweet became a historical artifact, screenshotted and shared as evidence of an era when admitting pharmaceutical dependence was content rather than crisis. 25 years old now, still alive. In the SoundCloud rap scene, that qualified as a senior citizen. The scene itself didn't die after the deaths, it just got older, which in internet years is basically the same thing as dying. The artists who survived aged out of the aesthetic. Hard to keep rapping about wanting to die when you're 25 with a mortgage and a management team, and the kind of responsibilities that require you to show up places sober. The face tattoos remained. Those don't wash off, no matter how much your PR. Team wishes they would, but the music evolved, got cleaner, less drugged sounding. Some of them got sober quietly without announcements, without making their recovery into content. Some kept using but stopped making it the centerpiece of their identity. The pills became personal instead of promotional. The new generation of rappers coming up didn't lean into Xanax the same way. Not because they were smarter or more cautious, or had learned anything from watching their predecessors die. Teenagers rarely learn from watching other people make mistakes. That's basically the definition of being a teenager. The wave had just passed. Musical trends are like that. They burn bright and then something else comes along, and the thing that defined an era becomes nostalgic rather than current. The sad boy aesthetic got replaced by other aesthetics. The Xanax references faded from every other song to occasional callbacks, throwback lines that reminded listeners of an era that had ended in funerals. The genre had moved on. The drug hadn't. Because here's the thing about the kids who grew up on that music. They were still around, still anxious, still looking for something to quiet the noise. They just weren't making it into art anymore. Or if they were, nobody was listening with the same intensity. The spotlight had moved. The pills had not. The pharmaceutical story continued in the background, the way pharmaceutical stories always do, quietly, profitably, and with excellent legal representation. Xanax prescriptions remained high. Not as astronomical as the peak years when doctors handed them out like party favours at a networking event, but still tens of millions annually. The drug that Upjohn had invented in a Kalamazoo laboratory was still doing exactly what it was designed to do, making anxious people less anxious, one prescription at a time for better and worse and everything in between. The Upjohn illness that critics had identified back in the 80s, the rebound anxiety, the dependence, the patients who couldn't quit without feeling worse than they'd felt before starting, was still creating customers. That was the beautiful nightmare of the business model. The drug that treats anxiety also creates the conditions for more anxiety, which requires more of the drug, which creates more dependence, which creates more prescriptions. It is not a conspiracy. It's just capitalism working exactly as designed. The invisible hand of the market, gently but firmly wrapped around millions of GABA receptors. The street supply remained a separate problem with a separate body count. Press pills still circulated, still killed people occasionally, still made headlines when the victim was famous enough to warrant coverage. The fentanyl crisis had gotten so large that Xanax specifically had become a smaller part of a bigger catastrophe. The bars were still out there. They just weren't the main character anymore. Something did change, though. Not enough to stop the deaths, but something. Harm reduction. The philosophy that if you can't stop people from using drugs, you can at least try to keep them alive while they do, started gaining mainstream acceptance, slowly, reluctantly, with the kind of institutional resistance that accompanies any idea that prioritizes keeping people alive over punishing them for their choices. Apparently, don't let people die was a controversial policy position. The debates were riveting. Fentanyl test strips became a thing. Small pieces of paper, cheap to produce, that could detect the presence of fentanyl in a drug sample before you put it in your body. Dissolve a tiny amount in water, dip the strip, wait 5 minutes. 1 line means fentanyl is present. 2 lines means it's not detected. A 5-minute investment that could save your life, less time than most people spend choosing a Netflix show, with significantly higher stakes. The strips weren't perfect. They couldn't tell you how much fentanyl was present, couldn't guarantee that the specific pill you were about to take was clean just because the sample you tested was. But it was information. And information, in a landscape where most deaths happened because people didn't know what they were taking, was at least marginally better than ignorance. For a while, the strips were technically illegal in many states. Drug paraphernalia laws written decades earlier classified anything used to test drugs as criminal. Possessing a piece of paper that could save your life was in certain jurisdictions a misdemeanor. Because nothing says effective drug policy like criminalizing survival tools. The laws started changing in the late 2010s and early 2020s. By 2023, federal funding could legally be used to purchase and distribute test strips. Organizations started handing them out alongside naloxone, the opioid reversal drug that could bring someone back from the edge of overdose. The infrastructure of harm reduction, built over decades by people who'd been criminalized for trying to keep their communities alive, started receiving something like official support. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The deaths continued. But it was something, a small intervention in a massive crisis, an acknowledgement that maybe the goal should be keeping people alive rather than punishing them for needing help. Revolutionary concept, apparently. The weird thing about the Xanax rap era is how quickly it became history. 5 years. That's roughly how long the window lasted, from the first SoundCloud uploads to the last major funeral. A half-decade of music about pills and pain and wanting to disappear, and then the moment passed and became something you referenced rather than lived in. An aesthetic period, like grunge or disco, except this one left behind a body count. Lil Peep's catalogue is frozen in time now. He'll never make another song, never evolve past 21, never become whatever he would have become if he'd survived. His music exists in a permanent present tense, always sad, always young, always exactly as damaged as he was when he recorded it. Fans still stream it constantly. Star Shopping has hundreds of millions of plays. The streams keep climbing even though the artist stopped breathing years ago. Juice WRLD left behind even more music. He'd been so prolific, so compulsively creative, that his estate has been releasing posthumous albums for years. Legends Never Die went to number 1, so did the next one. And the next. The kid who swallowed pills on a tarmac has sold more records dead than most artists sell alive. There's something uncomfortable about that. Grief as commerce. Mourning measured in streaming numbers. The same industry that failed to intervene while these kids were dying now profits from their catalogues indefinitely, releasing vault tracks and anniversary editions and deluxe reissues. The music that documented their destruction has become a renewable resource, generating revenue long after the artists themselves have been buried. The labels would argue, if anyone asked them directly, that releasing the music honours the artist's legacy, that the fans want it, that keeping the catalogue alive keeps the memory alive. And maybe that's true. Maybe the kids still listening to Lil Peep at 3 a.m. are getting something they need. Permission to feel broken, company in the darkness, proof that someone else felt this way too. But it's also true that the music industry makes money either way, and it's hard not to notice that the same system that didn't intervene when intervention might have helped is perfectly happy to monetize the aftermath. The show must go on, the streams must flow, the merch must ship. Could any of it have been prevented? Not the specific deaths. Those were individual tragedies with individual causes, and hindsight makes everything look avoidable. But the phenomenon. The culture that turned medication into identity. The pipeline from anxious teenager to SoundCloud artist to overdose statistic. If the mental health system were accessible, if therapy didn't have 6-month wait lists, if psychiatrists accepted insurance, if getting help didn't require navigating a bureaucratic maze designed to discourage anyone who wasn't already functioning well enough to navigate bureaucratic mazes, would kids still have reached for street pills? Kafka would have appreciated the efficiency. You need to be mentally healthy enough to prove you're mentally unhealthy. If the music industry had intervened earlier, if anyone in a position of power had said, "This person needs treatment, not another tour date," would it have made a difference? Probably not. That's the honest answer. The anxiety was real. The desperation was real. The gap between needing help and getting help was real. And when that gap exists, something will fill it. If not Xanax, then something else. If not SoundCloud, then some other platform. If not these specific kids, then other kids just like them. People in pain look for ways to stop hurting. That's not a moral failing. That's just being human. When the legitimate options are expensive or unavailable or insufficient, people find other options. When those other options come with risks, some people accept the risks because the alternative, continuing to hurt with no relief, feels unbearable. That's not a music industry problem or a pharmaceutical problem or even a drug problem. It's a human problem. One that's been around as long as humans have been anxious, which is to say, as long as humans have been human. The survivors are still figuring out what comes next. How do you grow up when your whole identity was built on not expecting to survive? How do you quit the substances that made you famous? How do you become someone other than the sad kid with the face tattoos, when the face tattoos are permanent and the sadness might be too? Diego Llanos is in his mid-20s now, which is older than Lil Peep ever got, older than Juice WRLD ever got. He's still making music, still posting, still navigating the strange territory of being known for something he's trying to distance himself from. Still alive, which counts for something, even if it doesn't make for good content. They're the ones who made it through, the ones who didn't become cautionary tales, the ones who got to learn from their mistakes instead of being memorialized for them. For every one of them, there are kids who didn't get famous, didn't get noticed, didn't get any of the resources that come with success. Kids who absorbed the same aesthetic, took the same pills, felt the same feelings, and died in bedrooms nobody wrote articles about. They don't have posthumous albums or tribute posts or documentaries. They just have families who miss them and friends who wonder what might have been different. This SoundCloud era produced stars and it produced graves. The same conditions that created Lil Peep created thousands of kids who never got discovered. They're the ones who don't show up in the story because nobody thought to write about them. Somewhere right now, in a bedroom in Florida or California or some suburb so generic it could be anywhere, a kid is uploading a track to the internet. The beat is slow, the vocals are drenched in autotune. The lyrics are about anxiety and pills and wanting to disappear. The production software was probably pirated. The microphone probably cost less than dinner. The feelings are real, even if the production values aren't. The kid might be fine. Statistically, most of them are fine. Most people who take Xanax don't die from it. Most people who make sad music don't become cautionary tales. Most people who feel like they're falling apart manage to hold themselves together long enough to grow out of the worst of it, to find better coping mechanisms, to build lives that accommodate their anxiety rather than being consumed by it. But some of them won't be fine. Some of them will get pills that aren't what they think they are. Some of them will make the same calculations their predecessors made and arrive at the same conclusions. Whether that kid will be fine or become another story depends on factors they can't control. The quality of their supply, the people around them, the luck of the draw in a lottery nobody asked to enter. The pharmaceutical company that invented Xanax doesn't really exist anymore, at least not in its original form. Upjohn was acquired by Pharmacia, which was acquired by Pfizer, which spun off its generic drug division, into a company called Viatris. The corporate genealogy is complicated enough that tracing a line from the lab in Kalamazoo to the bodies in bedrooms requires a flowchart and a lawyer. Accountability gets harder to assign when the company that created the problem has been restructured and renamed and absorbed into larger entities. That might be the point. The doctors who prescribe Xanax are still prescribing it. The patients who need it are still taking it. The alprazolam that Jackson Hester synthesized all those years ago is still doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was everything humans built around it. The marketing that created demand. The system that made legitimate help inaccessible. The street supply that turned a pharmaceutical into a lottery ticket. The culture that made self-destruction look like identity. The rappers who died didn't create that system. They just documented it. In real time, with beats and auto-tune and face tattoos. They made visible something that had been there all along. The desperation, the self-medication, the gap between suffering and relief. The music was the symptom. The pills were the treatment. The deaths were the side effect nobody wanted to acknowledge. Upjohn's chemists figured out the formula over 40 years ago. The rest of us are still trying to figure out what to do with it. They made a pill that quiets the noise. It works. That was never the question. The question was what happens when the noise is everywhere, when an entire generation grows up with more reasons to be anxious than any generation before them, when the systems designed to help can't keep up with the demand. The bars promised peace. Sometimes they delivered. Sometimes they delivered something else entirely. The music promised community. It delivered that too for a while. A place where anxious kids could find each other, could feel less alone, could hear their own feelings reflected back in 3-minute songs. The community survived the deaths. The community absorbed them, processed them, turned them into content and kept scrolling. And somewhere, a kid who's never heard any of this is discovering that Xanax makes the noise stop. Just for a little while, just long enough to feel okay, just enough to get through today. Whether tomorrow comes depends on things they can't control. Somewhere in Kalamazoo, the formula still exists in a filing cabinet. Somewhere in a bedroom, a kid is discovering it works. Somewhere in between, a lot of people are making money, and a lot of other people are making funerals. The only question is whether we'll keep watching it happen, or whether somewhere, somehow, someone will finally decide to fix the roof instead of selling more buckets. Until then, the bars are out there. The noise is out there. The kids are out there. And the pill just does what it was designed to do.